This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence.
So some U.S. government personnel who were working at our embassy in Havana, Cuba, on official duty, so they were there working on behalf of the U.S. embassy there. They've reported some incidents which have caused a variety of physical symptoms.
Throughout 2017, an odd story began to emerge out of Havana and was centered around the ongoing diplomatic tension between U.S. officials stationed there, just 90 or so miles away from American soil, and their Cuban counterparts. A quick backstory for those unfamiliar. For years, the U.S. had an embargo on the nation of Cuba. The embargo had been spawned from the decades-long Cold War, and Cuba, which had a close relationship with the Soviet Union, was essentially blacklisted from doing business with the US or its allies. The embargo came along with a bunch of additional diplomatic issues, but essentially severed relations between the US and Cuba, and they remained almost completely broken until just recently. During his presidency, Barack Obama worked to pull back this outdated policy, beginning a multi-year process that culminated in him normalizing relations between the two nations again. He even visited Cuba in March of 2016, becoming the first president to do so since Calvin Coolidge in 1928. In doing so, he vowed to end what he called the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas. This began the normalization between the US and Cuba, and both officially opened up embassies in each other's capitals, Washington, D.C. and Havana, respectively. However, upon taking office the next year, President Donald Trump set out to begin undoing this policy. He began ramping up tensions with Cuba and its leader, President Raul Castro, and his administration imposed increased restrictions on businesses and entities that did business with Cuba. Amidst this ongoing political whiplash, things were obviously tense between the US and Cuban officials working on building a relationship that had been non-existent, if not downright hostile, for decades. But in 2017, this palpable tension would begin to take shape in a very strange way. Earlier that year, in May, the US State Department had quietly expelled 2 Cuban diplomats from Washington, D.C. They did so without notice, but in August would address why, when State Department spokeswoman Heather Nauert said that there had been multiple incidents reported in the latter half of 2016 and early 2017. These incidents reportedly centered around several American diplomats and their family members stationed at the U.S. Embassy in Havana, who began reporting strange health symptoms.
Tell us about the incidents that have been going on in Havana affecting U.S. government workers there.
Yes. So we are certainly aware of what has happened there. Give me one second here. And that's why we got a little bit of a late start getting some recent updates for you on this. So some U.S. government personnel who were working at our embassy in Havana, Cuba, on official duty, so they were there working on behalf of the U.S. embassy there. They've reported some incidents which have caused a variety of physical symptoms. I'm not going to be able to give you a ton of information about this today, but I'll tell you what we do have that we can provide so far. We don't have any definitive answers about the source or the cause of what we consider to be incidents. We can tell you that on May 23rd, the State Department took further action. We asked 2 officials who were accredited at the Embassy of Cuba in the United States to depart the United States. Those 2 individuals have departed the United States. We take the situation very seriously. One of the things we talk about here often is that the safety and security of American citizens at home and abroad is our top priority. We're taking that situation seriously, and it's under investigation right now.
If the U.S. doesn't have a definitive answer on the cause or source of the incidents, why did it ask those 2 Cuban embassy officials to depart the U.S.?
Look, some of our people have had the option of leaving Cuba as a result for medical reasons.
How many?
I can't tell you the exact number of that, but I can.
What was it, in the tens, dozens?
I'm not going to characterize it. I do not believe it was that large, certainly not that large, but we had to bring some Americans home, or some Americans chose to come home as a result of that. And as a result of that, we've asked 2 Cubans to leave the United States, and they have.
In other words, this is a reciprocity thing.
I'm not going to call it as such, but we asked 2 people to go home.
And how long has this been going on for?
So we first heard about these incidents back in late 2016.
And who is leading the investigation?
The U.S. government is investigating this. I'm not going to get into it prior to that. I'm not going to get into it. You know which law enforcement agencies we have that would be concerned about this. The State Department is involved, but you could check with others as well.
And just real quickly, was it just State Department employees or other employees from other government agencies?
So these were, my understanding is that it has only affected State Department employees. This has not affected any private U.S. citizens down there. We take this very seriously. Look. This incident, and that's what we're calling it. We don't know exactly what.
Since 2016, you don't know what this incident is?
What this requires is providing medical examinations to these people. Initially, when they started reporting what I will just call symptoms, it took time to figure out what it was, and this is still ongoing. So we're monitoring it. We provide medical care and concern to those who believe that they have been affected by it, and we take this extremely seriously.
So just getting back to my question on reciprocity, and I know you don't want to use the word, but were the 2 Cubans told or asked to leave because of a similar or proportional drawdown in the U.S. staff in Havana because of the symptoms?
I'm not going to characterize it that way at all. I can only tell you that 2 were asked to leave, and they did.
Yeah, but
because what you're trying to do is you're trying to draw an equivalency. You're trying to say, 2 guys were asked to go home, and therefore X number of Americans were brought home. And I'm just not going to make that comparison.
I'm not saying there's a direct proportion, although maybe the Russians might disagree on that. But the reason that the 2 left is because you had to reduce your staff, or have the people who left Havana been replaced?
I'm not sure if our people who've left Havana have been replaced. I know that we've given our employees there a chance to come home if they would like to, and they have jobs here. Let me just mention one other thing about this. The Cuban government has a responsibility and an obligation under the Geneva Convention to protect our diplomats. So that is part of the reason why this is such a major concern of ours, why we take this so seriously, and in addition to the protection and security of Americans. I hope I've answered your question. Okay, hold on. Anything else on Cuba?
Can you just give us a sense of, are these medical problems ongoing, or was this a short-term thing?
And you've heard me say this here before, when we talk about medical issues about Americans, we don't get into it. So I can just tell you that it is a cause of great concern for us. It's caused a variety of physical symptoms in these American citizens who work for the U.S. government. We take those incidents very seriously, and there is an investigation currently underway.
I mean, can you say, are they life-threatening? I mean, the physical symptom wasn't death, was it?
No. It was not. It was not. Not life-threatening. Not life-threatening, and I'll leave it at that. Anything else on Cuba? Anything else on Cuba? We're done with Cuba, correct? Okay, let's go to North Korea. Hi.
A report from the Washington Post days later would go into some additional detail. In the fall of 2016, a series of U.S. diplomats began suffering unexplained losses of hearing, according to officials with knowledge of the investigation into the case. Some of the diplomats' symptoms were so severe that they were forced to cancel their tours early and return to the United States, officials said. After months of investigation, U.S. officials concluded that the diplomats had been attacked with an advanced sonic weapon that operated outside the range of audible sound and had been deployed either inside or outside their residences. In the wake of this tantalizing and mysterious story first being reported, some would go on to blame Cuba for this purported sonic attack on American diplomats, including U.S. Senator Marco Rubio, who directly accused Cuba of personal harm to U.S. officials without any actual evidence. Certain State Department officials, acting under guidance from President Trump, would use these reports as stated motivation to begin drawing back their diplomatic presence from Cuba. Yet Cuba would steadfastly deny any responsibility for the attacks, offering to assist the US investigation into the strange symptoms in any way possible. Others would go on to speculate that another foreign power, perhaps Russia, was behind the attacks, potentially using a sonic weapon that they had been developing, or trying to develop, for decades now. Rumors would even swirl that another cause, maybe poisoning, or even mass hysteria, may have been what resulted in the mysterious symptoms. Years later, though, the direct cause for these strange happenings has yet to be fully explained. Yet, this phenomenon that has evolved from a strange medical mystery into a geopolitical whodunnit owes its name to the place where the story began to unfold nearly a decade ago. This is the story of Havana Syndrome. In 2015, following President Obama's re-establishment of diplomatic relations with Cuba, a large number of US diplomats were sent there. They would begin to work with their counterparts on a number of issues or projects, and would relocate to the Havana area with their families. Like all foreign diplomats in Cuba, they would live in homes owned and maintained by the Cuban government, and were made aware that they were under constant surveillance by Cuba's state security apparatus. But this was nothing new. The same could be said for any diplomats that were sent anywhere, in a world where spycraft and diplomacy often go hand in hand. For the next year or so, things seemed to move forward pretty amicably. While there were undoubtedly discrepancies or workplace disagreements behind the scenes, they were kept there. This remained the case even though the new president, who took office in January 2017, seemed poised to change the direction of this diplomatic work. However, in the waning days of 2016, strange things began happening to several of the US diplomats in Havana, as well as their families. They began to hear strange sounds, loud frequencies that sounded unnatural, almost mechanical, uncomfortable without being deafening. Here is a brief example published by the Associated Press, which is uncomfortable to hear, but I have turned down significantly to not cause any real pain or discomfort. This audio was recorded by a US diplomat given a high-frequency recorder by embassy staff, after they had been made aware and wanted to learn more. At first, this noise was only heard by a single employee, but soon others began to report hearing the same exact thing. Others felt what they described as beams of sound or auditory vibrations, like white noise cranked up as loud as possible, but concentrated directly at them. While this in and of itself would have been annoying, it wasn't just the emergence of these strange sounds that caused a stir within the US Embassy in Havana. It was the symptoms that followed. Those that heard these sounds would face an onslaught of strange health issues, many of which came on immediately afterward, but quite a few of which would last for weeks, months, or indefinitely. These symptoms included hearing loss, nausea, dizziness, severe headaches, balance problems, tinnitus, brain swelling, speech problems, memory loss, or even concussion. Some of those afflicted would report just one or even a few of these symptoms, while others would report several. For that reason, it was hard to pin down an exact cause, or even what medical professionals were now dealing with. As I mentioned, some of these symptoms became prevalent almost immediately after hearing the strange frequencies, while others would emerge later. A report from The Guardian in September 2017 reads, "Some felt vibrations and heard sounds, loud ringing or a high-pitched chirping similar to crickets or cicadas. Others heard the grinding noise. Some victims awoke with ringing in their ears and fumbled for their alarm clocks, only to discover the ringing stopped when they moved away from their beds. The attacks seemed to come at night. Several victims reported they came in minute-long bursts. Yet others heard nothing, felt nothing. Later, their symptoms came. The scope keeps widening. On Tuesday, the State Department disclosed that doctors had confirmed another 2 cases, bringing the total American victims to 21. Some have mild traumatic brain injury, known as a concussion, and others permanent hearing loss." These incidents, as the State Department would later refer to them, began in the fall of 2016 and carried on sporadically through April of 2017. Those afflicted usually heard the strange sounds in their homes or bedrooms, but at least 2 cases took place in an upper floor of a popular Cuban hotel. There was no definitive cause. Some had their window open at the time, others didn't. Some had the TV on, others didn't. Some were sleeping, others weren't. Those affected would begin to see medical professionals at the embassy, but many would seek additional help with specialists back in the United States. There, they'd find just as much help. The symptoms were unexplainable, and doctors weren't able to determine what had happened. Ultimately, most of those affected were sent back to the US permanently, and at least 4 of those affected at the embassy were CIA officers who were working under diplomatic cover. Surprisingly, as US officials would soon find, the scope wasn't entirely limited to Americans. A number of Canadian diplomatic households in Havana had reported similar symptoms, such as hearing loss and sickness, including at least 1 case of the loud frequency resulting in a nosebleed. At least 8 Canadian victims would be identified, and just like the affected Americans, their symptoms varied wildly. However, a report from ProPublica noted that many of the Canadians reported hearing a different type of sound, which they described as a sudden twanging sound, like a piece of sheet metal being waved. Steve Dorsey of CBS News would go on to report about the dozens of men, women, and even children affected. Most of them, if not all of them, have been seriously hurt by this, symptoms including hearing loss, nausea, constant headaches, cognitive issues, including forgetting common words and phrases. We know some of them have concussions, and now we're learning about eye issues from some of the victims. Nearly a year would pass before the public became aware of this strange phenomenon, which federal authorities and medical experts had yet to fully grasp. Fulton Armstrong, a former CIA official that had once been stationed in Havana, told The Guardian, "None of this has a reasonable explanation. It's just mystery after mystery after mystery." We'll be back after a short break. Early on, investigators looking into the cause of these strange symptoms zeroed in on the possibility of sonic weapons of some kind being used, which sounds pretty incredulous on the surface. But outside of the logistics of these purported sonic weapons, there came a bunch of additional questions afterward. Namely, who had developed and used these sonic weapons? And most importantly, why? In August of 2017, an article from Live Science dove into the first part of that equation, the how. Their article pointed out the possibility of a device being developed that used infrasound, low-frequency sound that is below the hearing range of humans. As pointed out in the article, this is usually the type of sound that emanates from windmills, which has been reported on occasion to lead to symptoms like nausea, headaches, and dizziness. If a device had been developed that used infrasound in a directed way, it would stimulate and possibly damage the part of the ear not dedicated to hearing, which we often use for balance, called the vestibular system. The Live Science article also threw out another possibility: ultrasound, which is typically impossible to hear for humans. However, because of the limitations of ultrasound, this device would likely need to be very close to the victims, and because of the energy needed to power it, the heat would undoubtedly get directed towards the victim, causing their body temperature to rise. An ultrasound device would theoretically damage blood vessels in the ear, leading to at least some of the symptoms reported. Of the 2 possibilities, ultrasound was the more likely culprit, as it could be used to damage tissue, but neither could be eliminated as possibilities. If, that is, the theory about a sonic weapon being used was accurate. However, while these were 2 interesting possibilities, the logistics behind either seemed, to put it bluntly, impossible. Scientists and other health experts believe that if a device was being used to create a loud ultrasound or infrasound frequency, it would have to be an extremely large device. Likely not the kind of thing you could haul around in a duffel bag or a briefcase, for example. Maybe not even a regular-sized car, since the frequencies used against these victims had seemed to penetrate walls and doors, and were seemingly directed straight at them. And, surprisingly enough, neither ultrasound or infrasound would explain away all of the reported symptoms. Joseph Pompey, an ex-MIT researcher and psychoacoustics expert, told The Guardian, "Brain damage and concussions, it's not possible. Someone would have to submerge their head into a pool lined with very powerful ultrasound transducers." As would be reported by multiple outlets, the US had attempted to develop non-lethal sonic weapons for their military over many years, and this had resulted in a few attempts reaching usability, particularly in the type of sonic weapons used by the Navy to ward off pirates at sea. Versions of this had even found their way into county and state police forces, and were seen being used by police in Ferguson, Missouri to break up crowds years ago. But in all of these cases, the audio devices had been extremely loud. As noted by the New York Times, insufferably so. They weren't quietive or secretive like the frequencies reported by embassy staff in Havana. Yet authorities would not soon shake the idea that a long-range acoustic device, an LRAD, had been used in these specific incidents, which were often referred to as attacks. Others began to theorize that a different type of weapon had been used, so-called neuroweapons, which, TIL, come in many forms. The most common types of neuroweapons are biological agents and chemical weapons, but in this case it was theorized that directed energy weapons may have been used. Dr. James Giordano, author of the 2014 book Neurotechnology and National Security and Defense, Practical Considerations, Neuroethical Concerns. Kind of a mouthful. He stated as much when he was interviewed by federal authorities looking into this case. He believed that neuroweapons could have been used to create the widespread of symptoms seen in the victims from Havana, as he believed that directed energy beams could disrupt individual cells in the body. He theorized that the symptoms would be beset by several factors, such as proximity to the beam itself, duration of the attacks, and frequency, like if it happened over time, that sort of thing. Speaking to the publication National Defense, Dr. Giordano noted that directed energy weapons could create cavitation, air pockets in the inner ear, which would create air pockets or cavities that would then go on to burst. This would lead to not only damage within the inner ear, but those air pockets could go on to create additional problems in the brain. Needless to say, after all of this, there were a lot of theories that began to emerge in the weeks after Havana Syndrome, as it was called by the press, became public knowledge. Many of them sound pretty far-fetched or unrealistic, but the intelligence community was surprisingly muted about these possibilities, something that did not exactly instill confidence in the rest of us. Dr. Charles Rosenfarb, the medical director of the U.S. State Department, reported that these symptoms were most likely related to trauma from a non-natural source. No cause has been ruled out, but the findings suggest this was not an episode of mass hysteria. After these cases began to get reported by both US and Canadian diplomats in 2016 and 17, their authorities began to investigate. Before long, members of the FBI and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police traveled to Havana, where they swept through the various rooms looking for any kind of sonic devices that had been hidden in the walls, ceiling tiles, etc. Unsurprisingly, they found no evidence and would return home empty-handed. Whatever had happened had left behind no type of footprint, except in the bodies of those affected. Cuban officials, to their credit, cooperated with these investigations every step of the way. Most of the publications that covered this story seemed to ascribe to the belief that the Cubans were not directly responsible for these strange incidents, at least not intentionally. Although some would theorize that these symptoms may have been an accident, spawned from Cuba's attempts to eavesdrop on the American diplomats in their homes, using some kind of new technology, from which the strange, damaging frequencies leaked out in some way, while the Cubans were attempting to spy or download information from their electronic devices. US officials would later publicly suspect that this may have been the original intention behind the technology, that it had been developed as a tool meant to steal information from cell phones, tablets, or computers, but it had been repurposed when it was discovered it could inflict pain or discomfort. However, it has never been publicly alleged that Cuba had anything to do with it, yet that would not stop the political fallout. In September of 2017, the U.S. State Department would order the departure of non-emergency employees and their families to protect the safety of our personnel, and issued a travel advisory in which they urged U.S. citizens and residents to not travel to Cuba. Weeks later, the U.S. would expel 15 Cuban diplomats from the country, seemingly laying the blame at Cuba's feet, or at least retaliating against them in a symbolic way. In the months that followed, skeptics would arise to dispute many of the allegations made by US officials, including, but by no means limited to, the Cuban government. In December of 2017, Cuban scientists declared the bizarre incidents a collective psychogenic disorder based on anxieties and stressors experienced by the US and Canadians stationed in Havana. They also asserted that these strange, painful frequencies attributed to a sonic weapon may have just been crickets, of all things. In particular, the Jamaican field cricket, which many would highlight topped out at roughly 75 decibels, not nearly loud enough to damage the inner ear or cause any type of health concerns. Others believed that the sound may have come from cicadas, which similarly never really get loud enough to damage hearing. Over time, though, this usage of collective psychogenic disorder would be asserted by quite a few to assert that the victims were seemingly making up their symptoms. This rhetoric was used by a lot of commenters online that I typically enjoy, such as Cody Johnston from Some More News, who alluded to Havana Syndrome being a mass hysteria event. He and others would doubt the story being spun by the US, or rather, their framing of it, possibly for good reason. From the get-go, the naming convention of this disorder, Havana Syndrome, seemed to point the finger at the Cuban government. The expulsion of Cuban diplomats in retaliation had been the metaphorical cherry on top, seeming to subtly imply that the Cuban government was culpable, if not outright responsible. Many feared that this would be used as a diplomatic casus belli, a cause for the US government to cut off diplomatic ties with the island nation, which had only been re-established a few years back. President Trump's gut reaction to blame the Cubans on his favorite platform at the time, Twitter, seemed to confirm that this was a fight his administration wanted to pick. Some more conspiracy-driven individuals began to fear that the dissemination of the story through the media was similar to that used by reporters such as Judith Miller more than a decade beforehand, when she had published articles using bunk sources to lay the groundwork for the invasion of Iraq. Was this being used for similarly nefarious purposes? Despite skepticism over what exactly had happened to cause these health concerns, it soon became evident that something had happened to the early victims of these strange incidents. A report published by the Journal of American Medical Association in February 2018 concluded that, after a study of 21 employees at the American Embassy, that they appeared to have sustained injury to widespread brain networks without an associated history of head trauma. The studies of those involved would continue over many months and revealed some interesting, if not startling, things. Namely, neuroimaging showed differences in their brain matter, revealing that there were significant differences in brain volume, tissue properties, and connectivity between the patients and those in a health control group. As noted by Penn Medicine News in July 2019, there was reduced white matter volume in the affected patients, along with a pattern of differences in measures of water diffusion in the tissue. The imaging also revealed lower functional connectivity in the visuospatial and auditory subnetworks. Notably, differences in tissue volume, water diffusion, and connectivity were found in the cerebellum, the part of the brain responsible for performing voluntary tasks, such as walking and writing. Based on these scans, it did not look like the victims had suffered brain damage as previously reported, but whatever happened had physically changed their brains. This would lead to discrepancies about whether or not this change could be construed as brain damage or not. An investigation by the CDC, which began in 2017 and carried on for roughly 2 years, would fail to come to any definitive conclusions. Their report, finalized in 2019, concluded, "The primary steps of an epidemiological investigation are to establish the existence of an outbreak and verify the diagnosis. However, one challenge with this investigation is the lack of a well-defined diagnosis and an uncertain source of exposure attributable to the physical symptoms experienced by embassy employees." As noted by ProPublica, who published a great piece on the story in 2018, most of the incidents took place in the final weeks of 2016, as the United States and Cuba tried to stitch together any remaining agreements ahead of the incoming Trump presidency. Without getting into the politics of it all, Trump had made it no secret that he planned on ripping up the previous agreement at the earliest convenience and re-entering negotiations, something that Raul Castro and the rest of the Cuban government had no interest in. After all, what use was a diplomatic agreement if it could just be undone every few years? So ahead of that, politicians and reps from both sides hoped to figure out whatever they could in the time given to them, in the hopes that their work would last. At around the same time, in November of 2016, the incidents involving US and Canadian diplomats started. To embassy staffers, it seemed almost like someone was attempting to disrupt the ongoing negotiations, or at least cause some discomfort for those involved during this chaotic time. But who would do such a thing? It made no sense for the Cuban government to try and target US diplomats during this time, as they were seemingly trying their best to finalize any ongoing agreements. They also willingly let the US take the lead in the quest to figure out what had happened. Similarly, it made no sense for the US to target their own diplomats. So eyes peered out towards a potential third party, one that had already been making headlines for all the wrong reasons.
Sources tell CBS News 2 more Americans have been targeted in a mysterious sonic attack overseas. One of the victims worked in the U.S. Embassy in Uzbekistan, according to a source. Similar attacks have been reported by American diplomats in Cuba. Our sources say the latest incident suggests Russia might be involved in the attacks.
The Russians have the means, the motive, and the opportunity.
Foreign policy professor William Leogrand says Russian President Vladimir Putin has been trying to exert his nation's influence abroad.
It seems that this all began just around the same time that President Obama expelled 35 Russian diplomats because of Russia's interference in our election.
From the beginning of the story, Russia was floated as a potential culprit and for seemingly obvious reasons. In 2017, the world was still getting used to the new era of Russian aggression, with the nation having begun their invasion of the Ukrainian territories of Crimea and Donbass since 2014. At the same time, they had tasked their cyber units with spreading disinformation and propaganda throughout the world, culminating in their involvement in the 2016 US election, which could honestly become its own episode. In more obvious cases of spycraft, Russia had also become known for their orchestrated assassination attempts, perhaps best illustrated with the killing of Russian dissident Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, in which Russian agents slipped polonium into his tea, successfully killing him. However, this was by no means the only example, with them attempting to poison Russian opposition politician Vladimir Kara-Murza twice in 2015 and 2017, both times unsuccessfully. They'd also failed to kill opposition leader Alexei Navalny with poison in August of 2020, and he later got members of Russia's FSB on the phone to confess to their involvement, a conversation he recorded and released to the world. Pretty sure you could find it on YouTube. You may know Navalny as the opposition leader that was later sent to a prison work camp on trumped-up charges and was recently killed in Russian custody. So, needless to say, the idea of Russian intelligence developing and using a sonic weapon of some unique design doesn't seem to be really out of the question, especially since their assassination attempts showed unique levels of villainy that you would typically only see in James Bond movies. As I mentioned, Russian agents had slipped toxic levels of polonium into Alexander Litvinenko's tea, and in the attempt on Alexei Navalny's life in 2020, they had hidden the poison in the band of his underwear, where it was absorbed into his body through contact with the skin and left behind no evidence. It wasn't until Navalny got the FSB agents to confess that the world learned about how they had pulled off that attempt. Russia also had a long and storied history of harassing US diplomats around the world, particularly those stationed in Moscow, which was something that had been known for some time. It did not seem to be too outlandish to think that Russian agents would begin using said diplomats as their test subjects for this new type of sonic weapon, which, like many of their poisoning attempts, left behind almost no forensic evidence and was hard to keep track of. Plus, attacking the diplomats in Havana would also accomplish the objective of splintering the burgeoning US-Cuban relations, something that harkened back to the glory days of the USSR. The thing that Russian Federation President Vladimir Putin seemingly desires more than anything else. More after the break. In the years to come, Havana Syndrome would remain a matter of contention. Reports in 2019 cast doubt on the validity of the original health incidents. One of which being a report I already mentioned, about the study that highlighted how the brains of those affected weren't so much as damaged as they were changed. The other being a report that claimed the cause of the various symptoms was a harsh reaction to pesticides. All the while, new cases were being reported outside of Cuba, in nations such as China, Austria, Russia, India, and even the US, with 2 cases being reported in Washington, D.C. in November of 2020. More would follow, with there being no geographic link between them. Yet in 2020, a report commissioned by the US State Department, overseen by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, again suggested the involvement of radio frequency energy, the likes of which several intelligence agencies and militaries, such as the US and the Soviet Union/Russia, had been attempting to cultivate for decades. In fact, an NSA memo from 2014 which had resurfaced during that investigation indicated that intelligence from as far back as 2012 pointed to the possible existence of a high-powered microwave system weapon designed to bathe a target's living quarters in microwaves, causing numerous physical effects, including a damaged nervous system. However, as reported by CNN, this quoted memo did not necessarily confirm the existence of such a weapon, nor which country might have developed it, but did admit the possibility that this technology was in the works as far back as the 1990s, if not even earlier. Additional intelligence pointed to the Soviet Union using microwave beams to collect intelligence as far back as the 1960s, showing that this may have merely been a heightened version of that previously available technology, not all of which has been declassified to this day. The State Department's report concluded, after considering the information available to it and a set of possible mechanisms, the committee felt that many of the distinctive and acute signs, symptoms, and observations reported by the State Department employees are consistent with the effects of directed, pulsed radio frequency energy. Yet, an analysis by the CIA and 6 other intelligence agencies, which reviewed roughly 1,000 cases of reported Havana Syndrome, determined it was very unlikely a single adversary was to blame. CIA Director William J. Burns called this analysis one of the largest and most intensive investigations in the agency's history, yet was unable to lay the blame at any one entity. It would later come to light that this analysis may have been handcuffed by its own previously established guardrails, which insisted upon a stringent set of criteria that the agencies involved knew could not be reached without an insurmountable level of evidence, which they knew did not exist. While these various investigations struggled to come to any kind of consensus, cases were continuing to get reported around the world, not just in Cuba. But skeptics would point to the prior findings as proof that the anomalous health incidents, as the government had begun referring to these, was little more than mass hysteria born from stress and anxiety. A CIA investigation, finalized in 2022, reported that most of those claiming to have encountered Havana Syndrome symptoms had likely just suffered from previously undiagnosed medical conditions or heavy stress, but would note that around 24 cases, those first reported by those at the US Embassy in Havana in 2016 and 17, as well as a few others from around the world, remained unexplained. Pretty recently, in March of 2024, 60 Minutes on CBS ran a 30-minute segment on Havana Syndrome, which kicked it back up into the public consciousness for the first time in a year or so. It was actually the 4th time that this investigative series had taken a crack at this mysterious issue. And, as noted by host Scott Pelley, their researchers had discovered evidence implicating a potential culprit.
Most of the injured have fought for America, often in secret, and they're frustrated that the U.S. government publicly doubts that an adversary is targeting Americans. One of them is Carrie. We're disguising her and not using her last name because she's still an FBI agent working in counterintelligence. She says in 2021, she was home in Florida when she was hit by a crippling force.
And bam, inside my right ear, it was like a dentist drilling on steroids. That feeling when it gets too close to your eardrum, it's like that, times 10. It was like a high-pitched metallic drilling noise, and it knocked me forward. It a 45-degree angle this way.
She says she was by a window in her laundry room.
My right ear was line of sight to that window while this thing was happening in my ear. And when I leaned forward, it didn't knock me over, but it knocked me forward. I immediately felt pressure, and pressure and pain started coursing from inside my right ear, down my jaw, down my neck, and into my chest.
At the same time, FBI agent Carey told us the battery in her phone began to swell until it broke the case. Finally, she passed out on a couch. Because of chest pain, she was checked by a cardiologist and then returned to duty.
And I remember complaining to my colleagues for months after that. I felt like I had early Alzheimer's. Short-term memory, long-term memory, confusing memories, multitasking. My baseline changed. I was not the same person.
Carey's story matches those we've uncovered over the years.
It was like this piercing feeling on the side of my head. It was like, I remember it was on the right side of my head, and I got like vertigo.
Olivia Troy was Homeland Security Advisor to Vice President Mike Pence. In our 2022 report, she told us she was hit outside the White House.
And then severe ear pain started. So I liken it to if you put a Q-tip too far and you bounced off your eardrum. Well, imagine taking a sharp pencil and just kind of poking that.
And this man told us he was among the first publicly known cases in 2016 from our embassy in Cuba. That's how the incidents became known as Havana Syndrome. He's medically retired from an agency we can't name, blind in one eye and struggling for balance.
More than 100 people, American officials and their families, had been affected by the wide range of symptoms explored earlier in this episode. But this was just a small percentage of people who believed they had symptoms, with many others being ruled out as potential victims because their symptoms were either mild or they had only suffered from a small number of them. But what they almost all had in common was damage to the inner ear and, in more extreme circumstances, their brain, with many hearing strange sounds immediately preceding either pain or symptoms. As noted in the 60 Minutes segment, it was believed that a seemingly unrelated arrest in 2020 held some kind of connection to a number of these victims. This arrest was of a Russian man named Vitaly Kovalev, who was arrested in Florida in 2020 after leading police on a high-speed chase, with speeds exceeding 110 miles per hour. Funnily enough, Kovalev was being pulled over by cops for mere speeding, but led police on a chase that lasted more than 15 miles.
A search of the car found notes of bank accounts.
Citibank, Discover Savings, $75,000.
And this device that looks like a walkie-talkie can erase the car's computer data, including its GPS record. There was also a Russian passport.
What's your first name?
Vitaly, V-I-T-A-L-I-I.
Vitaly Kovalev was the driver from St. Petersburg, Russia, not Florida.
Why did you run? Let me be honest with me.
I don't know.
You don't know why you ran?
I don't know.
And we don't know why he ran, but what we learned suggests he was a Russian spy.
What we see here is Vitaly Kovalev fitting exactly this formula. He studied in a military institute. He studied radio electronics with a particular focus on use within the military of microelectronics. He had all the technology know-how that would be required for somebody to be assisting an operation that requires high technology. And then all of a sudden, after working for 2 years in a military institute, he up and decides to become a chef.
Kovalev immigrated to the U.S. and worked as a chef in New York and Washington, D.C., even appearing at Far Left in a TV cooking segment.
Traditional Russian recipes, thanks to our wonderful chef.
But Kovalev was actually a Russian military electrical engineer with a top-secret security clearance. Can someone like Kovalev simply decide to drop all of that and become a chef?
It is not an easy job to just leave that behind. Once you're in the military and you've been trained and the Ministry of Defense is invested in you, you remain at their beck and call for the rest of your life.
We don't know what Kovalev was up to, but our sources say over months he spent 80 hours being interviewed by FBI agent Kerry, who had investigated multiple Russian spies. Kovalev pled guilty to evading police and reckless driving. He was sentenced to 30 months. While he was in jail, Kerry says she was hit in Florida, and a year later when she awoke to the same symptoms in the middle of the night in California.
It felt like I was stuck in this state of like disorientation, not able to function, like, what is happening, and my whole body was pulsing.
Vitaly Kovalev served his time and in 2022 went back to Russia, ignoring American warnings that he was in danger because he'd spent so much time with the FBI. Christo Grozev found this death certificate from last year, which says Kovalev was killed at the front in Ukraine. Do you think Kovalev was sent to Ukraine as a punishment?
One theory is that he was sent there in order for him to be disposed of.
Is Kovalev really dead, or is this another cover story?
That is a very good question, and we actually worked on both hypotheses for a while. I do believe at this point that he was dead.
We're dealing with energy weapons. It's not going anywhere. Look how effective it's been. It's next generation weaponry, and unfortunately, it's been refined on some of us, and we're the test subjects.
Through the rest of the 60-minute segment, federal officials and investigators alluded to Russia being the party responsible for these anomalous health incidents, which the world had largely been calling Havana Syndrome since 2017. In doing so, these officials alleged Russian agents were seeming to target the best and most effective agents and diplomats, hoping to either sideline them or derail ongoing operations. And surprisingly, it seemed like this did not start in Havana in 2016, but rather similar symptoms had been reported as far back as 2014 in countries such as Germany and Ukraine. It was also learned that a Department of Defense official was believed to have been targeted at a NATO summit in 2023. 60 Minutes reported that a top-secret Russian intelligence unit had been behind the development and deployment of the sonic weapon used in these cases. FKU Military Unit 29155 had been linked to a directed energy weapon as far back as 2013, and 60 Minutes, along with their partners on this story, The Insider and Der Spiegel, had unearthed evidence of Russian government documents laying out the development of this purported weapon, in which someone was rewarded for developing potential capabilities of non-lethal acoustic weapons. They also discovered evidence of members of this top-secret Russian unit traveling through several countries at the onset of the attacks linked to Havana Syndrome. In the special, those interviewed also went into the disputed claims of Havana Syndrome, or rather what government officials had since been referring to as AHI, anomalous health incidents. They critiqued the government's findings from the years prior, in which America's intelligence agencies had refrained from naming any potential culprits. But those interviewed claimed that the government's barrier for making allegations was made impossibly high on purpose, in order to avoid telling tough truths, such as whether or not Americans, either abroad or even domestically, were in danger of such weapons. They also likely did not want to have to admit that Americans had been intentionally targeted by members of a foreign nation's intelligence agency, something that many believe would be akin to an act of war.
Attorney Mark Zaid represents more than 24 AHI clients. What do you make of the intelligence community assessment?
So, I've had access to classified information relating to AHI. I can't reveal it. I wouldn't reveal it. I will tell you that I don't believe it to be the entire story, and I know of information that undermines or contradicts what they are saying publicly.
Are you saying that the government wants to cover this up?
There is, in my view, without a doubt, evidence of a cover-up. Now, some of that cover-up is not necessarily that, oh, we found a weapon and we don't want anybody to know about it. What I've seen more so is we see lines of inquiry that would take us potentially to answers we don't want to have to deal with. So we're not going to explore any of those avenues.
As of this episode, the matter of Havana Syndrome, or anomalous health incidents, remains a hotly contested issue. When you search the subject online, you'll find that a lot of publications have pretty strong opinions on the matter. Some believe that it's real and a severe threat, likely caused by advanced weapons either made up of ultrasound frequencies or energy beams. Others believe that it's a 100% made-up complete boogeyman story made up to vilify a foreign nation, or several. Yet most seem to believe that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. But where in the middle? Well, that's the issue, isn't it? Personally, I don't doubt that the victims of this affliction are telling the truth, that their health complications have been severe, sudden, and/or persistent. Many of them have their symptoms backed up by doctors and neurological experts, who are just as stumped as the rest of us. And personally, I'm never one to tell someone that their pain isn't real. While it's hard for me to believe in the idea of secret energy rays or something of that nature, I also have to admit that I know painfully little of the world, and things that I once thought were creations made for science fiction novels are becoming more and more realistic every day. Is it possible for someone somewhere to have developed a sonic weapon that damages the inner ear? I mean, sure. 30 years ago, it seemed insane to say that we would all be carrying around tiny supercomputers in our pockets, or could download almost every movie, book, TV show, or video game known to man. But here we are. FBI Director Christopher Wray was asked about this very subject earlier this past week, in April of 2024, and this is what he had to say on the subject.
Yes, sir. Mark Zaid. One threat that he didn't mention was that of anomalous health incidents, or AHIs. Full disclosure, I represent a lot of American personnel, including FBI officials who have been diagnosed with TBIs and are receiving medical treatment from the U.S. government for it. And just a simple question of what, if anything, the FBI is doing that you can discuss to try and pursue those who we believe are criminally attacking our personnel.
Well, I won't, given your role, you will be well familiar with the IC's assessment of the origin of the attacks, but let me be clear, I am firmly convinced, and I don't need any persuading, that the symptoms and experiences that both our employees and other employees of the U.S. government are experiencing are very real and very serious. That's not an open question. The harder part is figuring out just what caused it and whether a foreign adversary is responsible in some way. And we continue throughout the U.S. government to do work on this and to continue to try to pursue leads that come in and so forth. So that work continues. There's not really much I could talk about in a setting like this on that. But then we're also trying to make sure that we're very focused on doing whatever we can to try to ensure that our employees have the care that they, I think, very much deserve. The FBI didn't initially get the same authority, for example, that some of the other agencies had gotten. That was changed, and now DOJ is, I think, imminently supposed to be putting out regulations that would allow some of these benefits to start flowing. I think that needs to happen as quickly as possible. So we're kind of going at it on two fronts. One is the sort of intelligence assessment, investigative front, and then the other is the, I guess what I would call the patient care front.
For this very issue, there seems to be a lot of smoke emanating from the Kremlin, and Russia's increasingly aggressive stance across the globe certainly makes me think that they might be responsible. Like I said, I believe that Russia may be behind these sonic attacks, and that's my opinion based on what I found and read over the past few weeks. I encourage anyone listening to do their own research on the subject, read all of the scientific studies and the government reports, check out what some reputable sources have said about this, and come to your own opinion. I am not stuck in my ways. I'm open to change my mind to new and emerging information, and hopefully more in this case will be revealed in the near future. But in this shadowy world of spies and espionage, it's possible that we'll only ever know slivers of the truth. Hopefully one day we can find out the true cause of these anomalous health incidents. But until such a time, the story of Havana Syndrome will remain unresolved.